Okay, good morning. So, Chodesh, good to get back to business, back to learning. So I thought for the next, I guess it'll take us probably a week or two, it would be a good idea to take a hot button issue, a sugya which is very much both in the news and in terms of us and halacha, something that's very important because it teaches us a lot at many different levels. And it happens to be related to this week's parasha as it so happens. But we're going to start in a slightly unusual way, and the topic is abortion. So we will touch a little bit to some extent, on current affairs. So I think perhaps there is no issue in modern culture, in modern life, which better personifies the need and the uniqueness for an authentic Jewish halachic Torah perspective and viewpoint. Because the way the debate, first of all, it's interesting to note that it is very much a live debate, right? So you had, for example, the way that it's framed is in America, for example, you have Roe v. Wade, right, 1973, which pretty much legalized abortion, and almost put it as a right. And we're not going to go so much into the details. And then we had the recent Dobbs decision, right? You familiar? Been following? No, which was actually leaked, which itself is another issue. So Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. I'll just read you a brief synopsis of where certainly the United States is at, and we'll talk a little bit about Germany as well, because that's also an interesting case in point. So, let's see if I can get so the background is as follows, very quickly, okay? So, the US Supreme Court in 1973, Roe v. Wade, as it's known, right, a landmark decision, is that a right to privacy based on the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution includes a woman's qualified right to terminate her own pregnancy. Okay? That's the basic idea. And then in 2022, you have it was actually a case it was a 2018 Mississippi state law that banned most abortion operations after the first 15 weeks of pregnancy. Jackson Women's Health Organization, which is Mississippi's only abortion clinic, had sued Thomas E. Dobbs, the state health officer, and the lower courts had prevented enforcement of the law, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Okay. Which also has a bit to do with that the Trump administration had appointed Justice Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. And the bottom line is, I'm just trying to get to here we go. There was actually, and then in May, there was a leaked decision of the Supreme Court, which itself is a fascinating thing. But on June the 4th, 2022, the court issued a decision that by a vote of 6-3, it reversed the lower court rulings. And essentially, it joined the opinion, it overturned Roe v. Wade and also another case called Casey. The majority held that abortion is not a constitutional right, as the Constitution does not mention it, and its substantive right was not deeply rooted in the country's history. And that is pretty much Chief Justice John Roberts, no relation, agreed with the judgment upholding the Mississippi law, but did not join the majority opinion to overturn Roe. Leading Republican politicians praised the decision, leading Democrats denounced it. There were protests and counter-protests, and polling indicated 55 to 60% of the public disapproved of overturning Roe. Either way, and this is without going into, and then we could talk about abortion in New York, and which itself is fascinating. I mean, a right-wing, sort of a conservative, black activist. Her name is Candace Owens, an interesting political figure. she has noted, and this is just, I'm saying this without comment and certainly without judgment, but the way she framed it is as follows. There's a lot of talk about, especially in liberal circles, about making sure that blacks in America are safe and they're not, killed by police and all this sort of stuff. And she said, actually, the most dangerous place for a black child in the United States today is in its mother's womb. It is the place where it is most likely to be terminated, killed, murdered, depending on your position, because the fascinating thing is that terminations, abortions, you're 4 to 5 times more likely as a black mother to have an abortion than other races, for various reasons. And so in other words, the point I'm making over here is it's a very highly emotionally and politically and morally charged issue. Now, the way it is usually framed in society is, certainly in America, is pro-life versus pro-choice. That's the way it's usually framed, right? I'm either pro-life or I'm pro-choice. Now, even these terms themselves are very loaded. Because if I'm not pro-life, then when I went to school, I would have thought the antonym, to life is death. But instead of saying pro-death, because that's the whole point, it's not pro-death, they say I'm pro-choice. And it is framed in terms of my right to decide what happens to my body. In other words, the fetus is then given morally, not given a status of being its own person, isn't given personhood, if you take the so-called pro-choice perspective, but rather it's part of it's a limb of my body. In the same way, it is up to me to decide if I wish to amputate my finger or whatever it is. So I'm pro-choice. It's my body, and I will do what I like with it. And that's kind of the way that it is framed. And therefore, in society, the debate is between those that say pro-life, and they are of the opinion that the fetus is an independent life, happens to be a host, you as the mother are hosting it, but it is a separate and independent life, and therefore you should not be morally allowed to take another life. That's the way it is framed on the more right-wing side, if you like, and the pro-life, and the way the argument is framed on the other side is pro-choice, that it's about choice, it's my body, and I will decide. Now, the first thing that we have to note before we go any further is this is not the way the Torah looks at it. And therefore, what we're going to try and discover is we're going to go beyond, one always has to go beyond the platitudes, beyond the rhetoric, beyond the emotive language that is used. And we need to look at the cold, hard facts in halacha. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have emotions. Of course we do. Before I go any further, 2 more points I want to make before we actually start proper. One is just interesting. It was interesting for me because I did a little bit of research to understand the situation of abortion in Germany. And maybe you know this because you live here, but to me it was news. Technically, abortion in Germany is still illegal, but not punishable during the first 12 weeks of pregnancy, as long as there's a condition of mandatory counseling. As long as mandatory counseling took place, abortion because of rape is legal in the first 12 weeks without mandatory counseling. Otherwise, otherwise, in the illegal but not punishable case, the woman needs to receive counseling 3 days prior to the abortion, etc. You're not allowed to advertise it. It's complex. Although there is talk now, and they are going to be changing the law, it seems, to some extent. But it's quite interesting to note, and of course it goes back to the Nazi era, which is the history of it. And it's interesting. Nazi Germany's eugenics laws severely punished abortion for Aryan women, but permitted abortion on wider, on more explicit grounds than before if the fetus was believed to be deformed or disabled, or termination was otherwise deemed desirable on eugenic grounds, such as the child or either parent suspected of being a carrier of a genetic disease. Sterilization of the parents also took place in some such cases. In the cases where the parents were Jewish, abortion was also not punished. So that's the background, and it gets complicated. Some statistics here, and this is from the federal office. The way I understand is the Grundgesetz is still that it is technically illegal. In the second quarter of 2022, approximately 25,600 abortions were reported in Germany. Destatis, which is the Federal Statistical Office, reports the number of abortions increased by 11.5% in the second quarter of 2022 compared with the first quarter. It increased by 11.5% in the second quarter of 2021 compared with the second quarter of 2022 compared with the second quarter of 2021. Anyway, so let's begin now to go a little bit more into some of the there's one more thing that I want to do before we get stuck in, and to me this is absolutely fascinating. I want to read you a quote, and the quote is actually in two different places, but I want to read you the following quote. If a child was not declared alive until 3 days after birth, then all parents could be allowed the choice that only a few are given under the present system. Have you ever heard of this quote before? I'll explain to you what the quote is. The quote was in an interview. It was actually in May 1973. It was an interview in Prism magazine, and it was I won't say who it is because I want you to kind of guess. The quote is that essentially the suggestion was, and the suggestion actually came from two people, one of them quoted the other. The suggestion was that a child should not be declared legally born and alive until 72 hours after parturition, after birth, during which time we could run a battery of tests on it to decide whether it's going to be healthy, it would develop normally, would it be a drain on society and society's resources, and if it was deemed within 72 hours after birth, it was deemed that it wasn't good idea to keep it, then we would just discard it, dispose of it. This is a suggestion. Who do you think would come up with such a suggestion? What do you think? Give it your best shot.
Charles Manson, I don't know.
Charles Manson, okay, I like it. So normally people come up with, something from, ranging from Hitler to whatever. And the answer might surprise you, and it is two gentlemen who are actually quite famous. James Watson and Francis Crick. Do those names ring any bell? They should. They were the scientists that discovered the double helix structure of DNA, for which they were rightly awarded the Nobel Prize, arguably the greatest scientific discovery and revolution in the last century. The discovery of genes. The double helix structure of DNA. This is Doctors Watson and Crick. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that either Watson or Crick were terrible people, although Watson actually, I'll send you some other stuff. Watson actually was virtually stripped of his Nobel Prize for being both racist and sexist and making anti-Semitic comments, and that's another whole separate thing, and you can Google that yourself and find out some of the stuff that he said, quite outrageous about women, about blacks, about other. But that, be that as it may, that's not where I'm coming from, and because that's only Watson, it's not Crick, but there's something. This is the important point I want to make before we go on into understanding the contrast, effectively, between the vox populis. Science does not exist in a vacuum. This is what you need to understand. That doesn't mean that people go around making stuff up, although sometimes they do. I'm not suggesting that. But we need to understand that science does not exist in a cultural or a historical vacuum. Ideas certainly have their time. Reb Dessler talks about this when he talks about evolution. Leaving aside the science for evolution for a moment. Leaving that whole debate out. And what do we mean when people throw about this term evolution? They usually don't have a clue what they're talking about. Is it macro? Is it micro? God of the gaps? Whatever. People just use this broad term and they genuinely have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. But leaving that aside, leaving that aside, there is a zeitgeist. There's a good German word that I can use. In England, I would be, I think, be possibly considered sophisticated. But there is a zeitgeist. The time was right for somebody to come along. God was on trial in the 19th century. Yeah, that's the reality. Until that point in time, it was pretty obvious to everybody that there was a God, right? God was no longer considered post the so-called Enlightenment, right? The French Revolution. So we had intellectuals who were questioning, skeptical about a higher moral authority. But we needed to find a scientific framework within which to place it, and evolution came along. And I'm not suggesting it was a crude conspiracy theory, of course not, but it happens within a particular time and place. What is the connection between Crick and Watson and this comment? And the sanctity of life. It's very simple. It is so simple. It is so simple. What they did, they discovered something amazing, absolutely amazing, which has helped mankind develop technologies and therapies and all sorts of medicines which have helped. Their discovery of the double helix of genes has made enormous strides in bettering the welfare of people. But at one level, it's not a question of blame, it's a reality. At one level, it's done something very, very dangerous, let's say. And that is, you have reduced the mystery of life down to 4 proteins, 4 amino acids, C, G, A, and T. That's all life is. Life is just a bundle of chemicals in a test tube kind of thing. We know exactly what it is. We can decode it. We've done the Human Genome Project. We've uncoded it. We've decoded it. We know exactly what it is. What happens if I'm baking a cake and it flops? It just doesn't work. You take it, you chuck it in the bin, and you start again. I made a baby. If a human being is no more than the sum of its parts, it's a bunch of amino acids, well then maybe I have the right. At least I could countenance a concept that would have been unthinkable decades before, centuries before. Certainly, it would have been unconscionable for a man of science, for a man of letters, for somebody who would be considered by virtue of knowledge, of having some form of a moral platform, moral authority, to suggest that we should take a living, breathing baby that has been born. We're not even talking about abortion here, to be clear. We're talking about a baby that is 2 days old, and we're running some tests and we discover, you know what? It's going to be a drain on the parents. It's got spina bifida. It's got whatever it is. Who said? And then, who then becomes the moral arbiter of which type of handicap? Where do you draw the line? It's such a slippery slope. But because all it is, it's a failed experiment. It's a bunch of amino acids that went wrong. We'll take it. We'll chuck it in the bin. We have reduced life. That's really what's going on over here. And I think that is this is. I'm not an expert in any way, not purporting to be an expert on science, on any of this stuff, but I think it's a mistake just to dive straight into the sugya of Torah without having an understanding of where we are coming from, to give it a uniquely Jewish flavor and to be able to contrast it intelligently with the debate in the public square. And that's why probably going to upload this to YouTube. It doesn't matter. I'm certainly not violating any of their standards or anybody's standards, but you see other people who debate it, even people such as Ben Shapiro, for example. I have an issue with it, although he's a strong moral voice. But because he's conflated by virtue of him wearing a kippah, it's almost implicitly understood that his perspective is a Torah perspective. I'm not convinced at all that it is, because the Torah perspective on it is far more nuanced. It's much more subtle and it's much deeper. It's not about Torah coming down on the side of pro-life versus pro-choice. We're going to discover this. It's not at all a given that the Torah views a fetus as an absolute nefesh. We're going to see this. It's much more complex and subtle than that. So just to say that the Torah, so somebody who's wearing a kippah, who's presenting a moral opinion, even though the opinion might might well be correct, but to then identify it with pro-life per se is not correct either. The Torah is not held, we are not going to hold this important topic hostage to the way the popular voices in society are going to frame it. This has to be seen within a Torah context. It's not polemics, it's not apologetics, it has to be seen within context, and the context is Torah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu as the arbiter of life. Shloisha shutfim ba'adam. There are three partners in the creation of a human being. Father, mother, and Hashem. Father provides part, the mother provides part, and Rabbinerseminar provides this neshama, nefesh chaya. There's Adama and there is a nefesh chaya. Man is created almost in two stages, the Mefarshim say, last week's parasha, right? He is Adama, and then Hashem puts into him a nefesh chaya. Vayehi ha'adam le nefesh chaya, says the Ramban. That lamed means it's a possessive. Man now belongs, the Adama bit, the flesh and blood, the earthly bit, belongs to the nefesh chaya. The nefesh chaya is the bit that is should be in control. To be a godly person. In fact, the Maral, the Malbim puts it the other way around. Beautiful Malbim. I'll just share this with you, and then we'll start. We'll dive a little. We'll begin to get into the halacha a little bit. Today, I suppose it's more of an introduction than anything else. The Malbim, if I'm not mistaken, is in Tehillim Ches. I might be wrong. I hadn't prepared to say this, but when the Mo enosh kisis korenu ve'nodam kisif gedenu v'tchasreu me'at me'elohim v'choved v'hoda ta'atrehu. The Malbim explains beautiful pshat. The Medrash says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Pasuk says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu paraded all the animals in front of Adam HaRishon, and he said to them, he questioned Adam HaRishon, said, what is their name? And Adam HaRishon was able spiritually to correctly identify this Ruchnis Dika DNA, and understand that a lion is an aleph and a resh and a yud and a hey in form of flesh. He understood. He was able with because Adam HaRishon had such a great neshama. He was able to actually genuinely decode the real the gene of the lion. And then Hashem says to him, "What should you be called?" And Adam HaRishon says, "I li noeh li korei Adam. I should be called Adam." Remember, Adam is both a common noun and a proper noun. Mankind, but it's also a name. Don't forget, it's a common noun and a proper noun. So Adam HaRishon responds to the Rabbinerseminar and he says, "Li noeh li korei Adam." It is appropriate that I should be called Adam. Why? Because I come from the Adama. I come from the earth. Adam, Adama. And the question is obvious. That's it? That's man? That's the definition of man? The point of having a name is a unique marker, a way to uniquely identify the essence of a person, of a thing. That's what a name means. In fact, the word shame and shom, as the Maral points out, is the same. There it is. That's it. Yeah? That is what man is? Earth? Says the Malbim, he turns it on its head. And he says, it's genius. He says, what he was actually saying was the opposite. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has many malachim. Srofim, Oifanim, Chayos HaKodesh. Each relate to a different olam, and they operate in a different way, and they have a different perspective, a different unique perspective of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Some say Kodesh, and some say Baruch. Le'umasam Baruch Yemeru. And they can't understand. We're the only ones that are able to combine and say HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yes? Not just Kadosh or not Baruch, but we're able to say HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Man is unique because man was created last, and therefore he was made up of a little bit of, as Nefesh HaChaim explains, a little bit of everything that was in all the koiches in the universe, and thus is able to be the engine and the driving force of everything. But man has a neshama, nefesh, ruach, chaya, yechida. Man is an incredibly divine creature, and Adam HaRishon was asking the following question: what makes this angel different to other angels? Man is a malach. Nefesh chaya, vayipach ba'apov nishmas chaya, man denofach midilei nofach. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as it were, blew of himself into him, whatever that means. Man has a nefesh from kisei, the kisei hakovod, that's his shoresh. That's where it comes from. That's why our nefesh is called kovod. Leman yizamercha kovod v'lo yidayim.
And it's also called heavy, so it's going...
But that's the challenge. That's gravity, right? The grave. But that is who. So what he was saying was the only thing that is unique about this malach is that it happens also to have an Adama component. Man is actually, this is what the Maharal is saying, the Pshat in the Medrash. I am a malach. What is unique about me as a malach, says Adam Arisha? The only thing that is unique is, unlike all other malachim, I have a little bit of Adama in me as well. But that's the only thing that makes me different from the Srofim, the Ifanim, and the Chayes HaKodesh. I also have, but I am fundamentally a malach. Li noeh lihi koreh Adam. It's a beautiful, beautiful Malbim, classic Malbim. This is what it means to be an Adam. And therefore, we come at this from a whole different perspective. We also need to think about how halacha, one last point, really final point. We also need to think about halacha and ethics and morality and how the two are connected and how one defines the other. But we, unlike society and the way that this debate is framed in terms of rights, always in terms of rights. My right, that entity's right, the fetus's right, my right.
Never obligations.
Obligations. We have 613 obligations. There are no absolute rights in Yiddishkeit. There are implied rights. The starting point of any Jew is, have I discharged my obligation? Maybe it's an obligation to self, an obligation to other, an obligation to Hashem. It could be positive, it could be negative. There are negative obligations. Lo signov. We don't start from the perspective of, I've bought this, therefore I have a right to my item, and therefore you may not steal. No. Lo sigzol is an absolute obligation that is incumbent upon every person. Because I bought something, but it's not to defend my right, it's about obligation. And when a Beis Din, by the way, the focus and the purpose of Beis Din is to help people discharge their religious obligations, to make restitution, to make things right, so that when they get to Shamayim, says the Maharal, that they're done, they have a clean slate. It's to help people discharge their obligations. So we're going to, even that alone is enough to show how the whole debate is different. It has nothing, it's not about rights. It's about chiyuvim, it's about obligations. And when obligations compete, then we're going to have all sorts of interesting stuff. Having said all of that, we'll just start. We'll make a very quick start. But I think that actually, this introduction, actually, I do genuinely believe was really, really important. Because if otherwise we just look at it, we have another way of looking at it. It is fundamentally different at so many different levels. And therefore, we are not partaking in the debate. And therefore, when we get to it later after the Torah, I'll read you some of the rabbinic organizations in America, quite carefully crafted responses and amicus curiae or representations to the US government. And they were done very carefully and worded very, very carefully. Okay? The idea is to show that we're not coming down necessarily on the right, as it were, on the side of pro-choice or indeed pro-life, but coming at it from a unique Torah perspective, which is much more nuanced, much more subtle, and very different. Having said all of that, Gal einai v'abiton iflois miteirasecha, Rabbeinu Shalom, open our eyes, let us appreciate the privilege which it is to get a window and insight into your world. This is the never forget. This is the other idea. It's the Rabbeinu Shalom's Welt. It's his world. And he has given us the obligation to be able to see it through his prism, which is his world. What does he want us to do? Okay. So let's start. We start off with a Gemara in Sanhedrin. The easiest way to start here. Just a second. Make sure I've got my... Yeah, the Gemara in Sanhedrin is where we start. That's your first source over here, Sanhedrin on Zayin Amud Beis. And we're going to go backwards and forwards between various different sources, and there'll be another source sheet when we finish this one as well. A pasuk in this week's parasha, Shoifech dam ha'odam ba'odam domo yishafech. The first point to note before we go any further is that we are talking pre-Matan Torah. So that's obviously important, before Sinai. Yeah? What does the Torah say? Shofech dam ha'odom ba'odom domoi yishofech. Somebody who spills the blood of a man inside a man, his blood shall be spilled. Right? Asks the Gemara, where do you find an idea, a concept of dam ha'odom ba'odom? The blood of a person inside another person. When do you have a person inside another person? Any ideas? Ezehu Adam shehu ba'adam. When do you have an Adam which is in another Adam? This refers to a fetus in its mother's womb. Point number one. What do we see from this, guys? What do you see from this Gemara? What do you draw from this Gemara?
That it counts as blood spilling even if it's like a little.
Correct. So put it in clearer legal terms.
It's not a part of the. It's not. It's a.
Put it in positive legal terms.
It's a exclusive. It's a, how do you say, a separate being.
Okay. So what it means is that in that feticide, to kill, to consciously for a ben Noach. This is not about a Jew. This is a ben Noach,
Right.
and this has massive implications, my friends, for, let's say, an Orthodox Jewish doctor or nurse who is asked to help or aid a part of a process, an abortion. If it is a problem, which this Gemara seems to say that it is, we'll have to look at the halacha. If it is forbidden for a Gentile to perform an abortion, min ha-Torah, and it is itself a capital offense. That's the other thing. Domo yishafech. It's a capital offense. It's punishable by death. So you see clearly that the Torah recognizes the personhood of an Adam ba'Adam. It's called an Adam. They almost would appear to be equated. Now this is going to be a problem. Adam. It's one Adam inside another Adam. And therefore for a Ben Noach it is a capital offense, which creates a very real, I'm just going to throw it out there, very real halachic issue potentially we're going to have to deal with at some stage. An Orthodox nurse or a doctor, or a Jewish doctor, out in broader, wider society performing or aiding an abortion on a Gentile is very possibly a real problem. Let's shelve it. I just want to make that point. So a non-Jew is culpable for murder if he performs an abortion. So far, so
Okay.
challenging. Now, a Mishnah, we now go to source 2, a Mishnah in Nida, Daf Mem Gimel Amud Beis Mem Daled Amud Aleph. Tinoikes bas yom echad metamo benida, bas yud yomim metamo beziva. Tinoik ben yom echad metame beziva, metame benegoyim, or metame bitmei meis. The Mishnah reveals to us various halachas, the implications and the status of a young infant who's just been born. At what stage do they become liable? At what stage do they become relevant in terms of various different types of tumah, impurity? But the last two words is what interests us today. V'hahorgoi chayev. If you kill a 1-day-old infant, an infant that is born, if you kill them, is chayev. Ask me a question. Chayev Misa, obviously. If you kill a 1-day-old infant, you're Chayev Misa.
So, source 1 and 2, how can it be that?
Explain, talk.
If source 1 says that even for non-Jews, it should be Chayev Misa, even if it's still in the body, how can it be then that for, I guess this is not talking about Noachite.
Very good. So you're already one stage ahead. Very good. So you have quite rightly inferred from the context of the Mishnah that this is not, whereas the sugya over there in the Gemara, the Pasuk in Noach is talking clearly about a non-Jew, clearly talking about Noachites. Whereas here we are clearly talking about, this is talking about halachas for Jews.
Yeah.
So therefore we would appear to come out with the following topsy-turvy situation, whereby for a Gentile an abortion is a chiyuv misa, whereas for a Jew it would appear to be okay. to abort a Jewish child. Why? Because it says only if you kill a kid that is 1 day old.
Yeah.
The implication is that there is no Chiyuv Misa. Now, can we infer that it's okay to do? I don't know. But one thing we can certainly infer, it's not the same. It seems to be worse off for a Gentile, for a Ben Noachite, than it is for a Jew.
I mean, I guess the question here in source 2 would be, what do they call Yom the first day?
Well, that's irrelevant. It means once it's been born. Once it's been born.
Okay.
As opposed to when it's in the mother's womb, as in the fetus.
Yeah.
So we have the problem. The Ramban, source 3, the Ramban states this explicitly. This is the Ramban in Nida. Now, there's also a Tosfos in Nida, which we're going to have to look at maybe tomorrow. There's 2 Tosfos that we're going to have to look at. But let's look at this Ramban. Says the Ramban, V'davka, says the Ramban, V'davka ben yom echad, this applies specifically and exclusively to a child that is already born, aval uber loy, but not to a fetus, the karina bei nefesh adam. It is not called a nefesh adam. V'hochinam yaminun b'Sanhedrin, and so indeed it says in Sanhedrin, ha'isha shehi makshelei leid, which is actually a Mishnah in Oholos, which we're going to have to look at very carefully. The Gemara in Sanhedrin explains a Mishnah in Oholos. What would be if a woman is nebuch, her life is threatened during childbirth. So the child has not yet been born, but the process of birth is threatening the life of the mother. The Mishnah is unequivocal. Chad v'chalak, it's clear. The Mishnah says, Mavi'in sakin, sorry, it's a bit gory, but the Mishnah states the halacha very clearly. Mavi'in sakin, they bring a knife, and they cut out the fetus limb by limb. In other words, I know it's very graphic, but it's very clear. When during birth, if the fetus challenges the viability of the life of the mother, then the mother wins hands down. However, Yotza Roishoi, once, however, the head of the baby has been born, Ein Noigin Boy, says the Mishnah, you can't touch him. She'ein doichin nefesh mipnei nefesh. You can't, and this is something we're going to spend some time discussing also, you can't make a quality judgment on one soul and therefore use one to say it is of more value than another. And therefore, what we do is another story, but what you see from here clearly is that before it's born, it does not have the status of a nefesh. Once it's born, only then. Alma, says the Ramban, Alma, me'ikora leka mishum atzalas nefesh. You see, therefore, before it is born, there is no concept of saving. Now, it's interesting how he frames it. He says, hatzalas nefesh. There's no imperative to save the soul. He brings another proof, which we'll leave for the moment, but he brings 2 proofs. His position seems to be very clear, that until the fetus is born, it's not called a nefesh. It's not called a nefesh. So at the moment, we are left only with a question, not an answer. We are left with the following question. This is where we're going to leave it for today. I have to make sure you come back tomorrow, right? The question is as follows. We have a Gemara that's very clearly, unequivocally states that for a Ben Noach, for a Gentile, abortion is a capital offense. We have a Gemara that says, a Mishnah that says that for a Jew, it is only infanticide to kill a baby that is already born. The implication, and the Ramban clearly explains to us, this is the correct way to learn the Mishnah in Nida, that for a fetus, it's not yet considered a nefesh. So how do we, is it a problem? Maybe there's a 2-tier value system. Doesn't sound right. It isn't. And we're going to see tomorrow, Mi'etz Hashem, we'll start giving some explanations.